say what an honor it is to be here, to be able to give this inaugural address for the Social Justice Studies. I served at UVic on the Social Justice Committee while I was on faculty and on the Board of Governors here, and I must say at that time it was a little tiny kind of fringe committee, and here we are now right in the middle of everything with 42 professors involved and all the different faculties that touch on human social justice engaged in this. And here we are tonight in a theater of kindred spirits. It's really marvelous to be here. Thank you. My talk is called Changing the World, What Works? I think 10 or 15 years ago, had I been giving this talk, it would have been Changing the World, Can we have any impact? Or can one person make a difference? Or can a million people make a difference? And I was fairly discouraged working on the nuclear issue, thinking that maybe we would never make a difference. But in fact, now I know that we are making a huge difference, and that is what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to try to address more than just the issues of war and peace, and address things that engage concerned women, children, students, entertainers, artists, people who want to work in the political field, and so on. Somebody sent me this postcard, and I just love it. It's almost an icon for me to think of the world like this. This is a sacred site in Burma, the Gold Rock. And every time I look at it and think of how it looks as if in the next 5 minutes it's going to crash down the hill and kill all the people below, I think it's rather the way we feel sometimes about the world right now in terms of the environment and the economic collapse and the uncertainties that we're facing. And what really strikes me is that if this rock happened to be above the city of Victoria, I'm guessing that we would either blow it up or push it down or pull it back, right? We certainly would not leave such a dangerous rock sitting right above us. But what did they do? But the Burmese monks covered it with gold foil and made it a sacred site. So in a way, it's a reminder of how fragile life is, and also what a blessing it is to live whatever is held for us in the future. I'm going to start first by talking about some of the forces that are obvious to us that are changing the planet at this time. Forces for change, and obviously for change for good and for bad. International law in the United Nations is a big one. Civil society, and I'll talk more about what I mean by civil society in a moment. Media and communications networks, women, and then others. And I leave you to fill in 10 things in that gap, because the world is changing so rapidly. All kinds of things that we never thought were influential before turn out to be influential. I'm going to start with this question, and I see a lot of you guys out here that have heard this speech before, so I expect the right answers. Has the number of major wars and genocides, that means more than 1,000 battle deaths per year, increased or decreased since the end of the Cold War in 1991? If you think that the number of wars has increased since 1991, put up your hands, please. You guys. Okay, how many of you think they've decreased? Oh, I thought there would be more. Okay, this report came out in 1985, and I've been quoting it all over the world, and I want to tell you that you're right in line with Germany. I was in Munich just a few months ago and spoke, and there was one of the leading figures from the United Nations Peace and Disarmament Division, and he got the question wrong and came up and had to apologize and shake my hand and say, "I failed your exam, I'm really sorry." Anyway, the answer is major wars and genocides have decreased by 90% since 1991. That's the end of the Cold War. And the big question is, Why don't we know this information? Why is it such a shock when I tell people this information, and it's now been out for 4 years? This is information in the Human Security Report. The Center for Human Security was at UBC under Lloyd Axworthy. It's now at Simon Fraser. You can pull off this report on the internet. It's, I think, 73 pages or something like that. It is totally eye-opening reading. And each year they present a new report, and each time it's even more thrilling than the one before, and we are making progress year by year by year. So I really encourage you to look at this site, pull down their reports, and read them. They're citing very, very well-known and credible statistics, so I'm not telling you something radical and left-wing. Okay, what about wars in general? Because many people have felt that if these big wars have declined, then obviously people have to go on fighting. So now they're fighting inside their own borders. I'm not going to ask you to put up your hands because I've discovered people stop putting up their hands. When they're wrong the first time, they won't try a second time. But armed conflict in general is a smaller conflict. Have decreased by 40% since 1991, same reference. 60 dictators have been toppled with minimal violence since 1986 when Marcos was toppled in the Philippines. Just before this report came out, I had been thinking of writing a paper, going back and looking at all the dictators who've been toppled, and I thought, I wonder if there's been 15 or 20 or how many, and I started trying to research them. And then I gave up. I don't have a lot of staying power on looking all of these things up. So I didn't research it any further, and out came this report saying it's 60 dictators. And I asked at a recent meeting whether Nepal should count as number 61. This was out at Pearson College, and a Nepalese student came up and said, absolutely, Nepal is 61. Democracy may look fragile, but it's got a really good foothold in Nepal. And the surprising conclusion from the researchers at the Center for Human Security, their conclusion is the world is turning away from war. In fact, they say the world is becoming war averse. And why is that happening? So their answers are the first 3 of these bullet points. They say that it's the influence and the strength of the United Nations, the growing power of international law, particularly since the founding of the International Criminal Court, which allows us to arrest and try individual world leaders who formerly had impunity if they started a genocidal war, but can no longer get away with it. Now the world can hold them accountable. The tremendously rapid increase in the influence of civil society, and I've added the 4th one, which is the changing role of women, the growing influence of women in the smallest communities all over the world. And their influence is changing everything. American audiences always roll their eyes when I talk about the United Nations and their role in improving the situation, particularly with regard to armed conflict. And they say, well, the UN is nothing but a debating society and completely powerless. When the RAND Corporation did a study on what was the success rate in nation building of the United States versus the United Nations. And they found that the UN had a record of 67% of the nation building initiatives were successful. And I haven't gone back to the original document to find out how the US fared, but they don't even get a mention in the Human Security Report. So that is an incredible rate of success, in fact, if you think of how difficult it is. Those of you who do mediation or business conflict resolution know how hard it is. So for this statistic to be so strong on behalf of the United Nations is really a surprise. 70% of the workers in the world for peace and social justice are women. Again, these are UN figures borne out again and again when I go to meetings all over the world, that the majority of people who come out who are doing the grassroots work are women. And this picture is from the Nonviolent Peace Force, which was starting up work in Sri Lanka 3 or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I guess. And the women came to the Nonviolent Peace Force and said, we need your help. And these people were just getting going, you know, they hardly had their procedures in place yet. And these women said, our children were kidnapped at a temple festival, and they've been taken by the Tamil Tigers. They've been taken away to be child soldiers and sex slaves out in the jungle, and we want you to get them back for us. And we want to go with you. So the Nonviolent Peace Force people went and met with UNICEF and said, what on earth are we going to do? We have no idea how we could get these children back. And UNICEF said, remember that your role is to be witnesses. You will protect those women by your mere presence. The women will do all of the negotiating. So you head out into the jungle with the women. They knew exactly where these rebels were. They knew where the children were being held. All of these things always surprise me. But anyway, they knew where. So, and UNICEF said, and at 2 o'clock, we will come and bring tea and cookies, because we'll have heard that there are women out there in the jungle on a very hot day, and everyone should have refreshments. It's only fitting. So the Peace Force headed into the jungle with these women, and they first met one of the rebels, and they said, we are here to get our children back. It's absolutely wrong what you are doing. We do not support it, and we demand that you return them to us right now. So this young man went to the commandante, I guess, and brought him forward, and these women said, you are to give us our children back. What you are doing is wrong. We don't support this. We may support independence. We do not support child soldiers and what you're doing. And as they were getting into this huge tirade, UNICEF arrived and served everyone tea and passed the cookies around, and they all talked very genially, UNICEF being very polite and diplomatic, of course. And in the end, the leaders said, yes, you may have your children back, and here's bus fare to get them back into the city. Now I want you, in hearing some of these stories, I want you to think about what kind of principles do we learn from these astonishing acts, these acts of great courage and creativity. Civil society, this is a picture of the protests in 2003, February the 15th, when millions and millions of people around the world took to the streets to try to prevent the bombing of Iraq. Many of the authoritative articles say 15 million people, but a lot of the peace articles that I read would make it more like 30 million, I think, when you add up the millions in major cities all over the world. This is New York, and the New York Times ran an editorial that said, it appears there are still 2 superpowers in the world, the United States and world public opinion. I call world public opinion civil society. That's what we represent. Civil society, and this is a definition from Nicholas Perlas. He says, civil society is the conscience that constrains the actions of government and big business. So all of the different groups that you belong to and all the ways that you work as an individual, acting as the social conscience of whatever power brokers you're dealing with, everything that you do in that sense is your role as civil society. So if you happen to work for the government, but you are in fact not representing them, you're representing Native women's rights, then you're working in civil society and your job happens to be with the government. And that's great. Perlas says that there are 3 pillars to society. government, a healthy economy, and a strong civil society. And all three of them have to be strong and have to be effectively working. Now, when I read this book, I can't remember the title of this book, but anyway, when I read it, it changed the way that I related to government officials and my member of parliament when I was meeting with them, because I no longer thought of them the way I did when I was just out there protesting all the time. And I felt like I was knocking on the door and saying, please, please listen to us about nuclear weapons. You have to hear how terrible they are. Then I realized I was one of these three pillars. Well, here I am. I've come to speak to you as one of the three pillars of our society, and I can tell you I'm concerned about nuclear weapons, and I want you to be concerned too. It's a totally different feeling inside to know that you have the power that Perlas and others are talking about. So I want to talk about some of the success stories of civil society, some that I've been involved in, and then some that I hear about when I listen to the BBC World Service overnight at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's a very bad habit. Do not cultivate this bad habit, but it's how I got a lot of material for my book. This is the book. It's outside, and the book is a collection of stories of successful, nonviolent interventions that have prevented war or ended violent conflict at all different levels, and it tells you what they're the actual stories that have happened, so we know that they work. What women have done, what church groups have done, what little kids have done, what various world leaders have done through their own tremendous vision. Anyway, what I discovered, what I knew in working in disarmament for so many years, is that it's better to light one candle than forever curse the darkness. We can spend an awful lot of time crabbing and complaining, but if instead we can go out and do one deed that might make a small difference, and we never know what kind of difference we're going to make, that's way better. So the first one I'll talk about is the Landmines Treaty. In 1993, there was a little meeting held in a convent in London, and the organizers called for leaders of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who had some kind of interest in peace and disarmament, to meet in London to talk about the possibility of trying to get a ban on landmines, anti-personnel landmines. So I went. There were 50 people. It was organized by Jody Williams and the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation, but it brought in leaders from the International Committee of the Red Cross, Handicap International, Mines Action Group in London, the deminers who go out and train local people how to remove landmines and so on. A very, very high-powered group. And that particular little conference was a real eye-opener for me. We met for 3 days. The first day was all education, learning about what landmines do from the perspective of surgeons and rehab physicians, from the point of view of economics, from the point of view of the deminers, from the point of view of the military. And then in the second day, we started to strategize, and by the time of the third day, we had a group of journalists from the alternative press and alternative media, including documentary filmmaking, and they just stood up and they said, all right, here's what we have to do. And we had 3 hours, and I have just never sort of, you know that poster of the guy who's listening to the stereo and his hair is blowing out behind him? That's how I felt, like, whoo! They said, we need people who know leaders in government who are likely to be sympathetic. Do not waste your time trying to convince someone that you know. If you already know they're not sympathetic, go directly to the ones who are likely to be on our side. Who knows some celebrities? We need celebrities in film and music. We need Princess Diana. Once we got Princess Diana, I'll tell you, things really started to move. Lloyd Axworthy was the one in the Canadian government who was the point person and absolutely centrally important in getting the treaty. They said, now we're going to start writing, and we write stories, we need illustrations. So we need all of your photographs, all of your movie footage, If you're a surgeon, we want all of the photographs in the operating room. We want everything to show the impact of landmines. We want little children. We want the story about the mother in Cambodia, the children in Mozambique. We know all of these stories have to come out. And within 6 months, the International Committee of the Red Cross had a movie out, and there were pictures appearing in magazines, color, big weekend magazines. So after the magazines came more long-term things, bigger documentaries, and then we started seeing the impact in local newspapers where groups were taking up this issue. 1993 was when it started. 1996, 3 years later, Lloyd Axworthy called a meeting of like-minded states to come to Ottawa to bypass the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva and talk about the possibility of writing a landmines treaty. All of those countries came, and Lloyd got so excited by the whole thing, he said, meet back here a year from now in December and we will sign the treaty. And in the meantime, we're going to write it. So they wrote this treaty, and in about, I can't remember exactly, May or June, we were all connected. Remember, this is 1995. We're all connected by fax machine, and a few people were connected by email, but most groups were still communicating by fax. And we got the word that the United States was boycotting everything, had boycotted the whole thing all the way along. But the meeting was going on in Norway to finalize the text that would be brought forward in December. So this was a critical meeting. And we got the word that the United States was flying in, and they wanted to stop the whole thing and have the treaty rewritten the way that they wanted it. So we were all in touch by fax with all of these wonderful bureaucrats from the Canadian government, in my case, and other countries as well, with these sympathetic guys, mostly men, no, not mostly men, about 50-50 I think they were, anyway, sending us back faxes, telling us what was happening, and saying now they want us to change the treaty so that it would say landmines are not legal under international law except in time of war. And then they said, okay, we'll have a treaty, but there'll be an exception for the landmines that are on the border between North and South Korea. Those ones have to stay. So people were making these big posters saying no exceptions, I can't remember how it goes, no ifs, ands, and buts anyway. And we were faxing, like my fax machine was just going day and night to get messages to the Canadian government that sort of saying, we know what you're doing, and we insist that you hold firm. Canada said we need 48 hours for the United States to make its case. And in that 48 hours, they didn't succeed, and the treaty went ahead, and it's a very good treaty. Its only flaw is that it didn't exclude cluster bombs, didn't forbid cluster bombs. And that was a conscious decision on the part of the campaign. We didn't think we'd ever get it if we went and demanded that cluster bombs also be banned. But anyway, other than that, it's a great treaty. 1997, so 4 years from start to finish for civil society to pull that one off. Civil society took nuclear weapons to court. In this story, there was a group of people in New Zealand who got together with a group of lawyers and a magistrate, and they said, if dum-dum bullets are against international law, banned by the Geneva Convention, surely nuclear weapons are illegal. And the lawyers said, well, it's all fine for us to say that they must be illegal, but unless the International Court of Justice gives a written opinion that indeed they are illegal, it doesn't matter, it doesn't make any difference. And so this little tiny group of people said, well, then let's have a worldwide campaign to get the International Court of Justice to give us that opinion. But we can't approach the court because we're individuals. A nation state can, or an agency of the United Nations, or the United Nations General Assembly can. So then the project was to get those, and the World Health Organization could. The project became targeted for all of those who had the capacity to get the ICJ to give the opinion. And I'll cut to the chase and tell you that we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. The boxes behind these people, that's the ICJ in The Hague, in the back of the picture, and the boxes contain millions, 3 million signatures of people who wrote declarations of conscience to indicate what the public conscience was saying, and those weighed very strongly on the judges. The judge's opinion said that indeed nuclear weapons are not legal under international law, and that the nuclear weapon states have a solemn treaty obligation to proceed immediately to nuclear disarmament. And it was the first time there had ever been an interpretation of the preamble to the treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the nuclear weapon states had always said, oh, it's a preamble, it doesn't mean anything, there's no obligation. And the court said, this is a treaty obligation. And we have been able to use that now in courts of law, particularly where activists have taken civil disobedience actions, such as breaking into the Fast Lane nuclear facility and so on. And they have been acquitted by the British courts because they have said they did the action because none of the legal means that they had used had been effective, and having a triad submarine in the Fast Lane was against international law, and the court found that they were indeed right. And international law trumps national law. So that one took from the late 80s. I think 1988 was when we first began working on it, and it took us until 1996 to get that declaration. International Criminal Court began as a civil society initiative, and Bill Pace, one of the central figures in getting it founded, said that he thought it would be about the year 2099 that it would actually happen, and instead it was in 1999. So it's an amazing thing that has been produced there. Novel ideas. I'm now going to talk about some of the stories that I've written up in my book that I hope will stimulate you to have some creative ideas about different ways to look at problems. This man is Antonis Mockus, who became one of the very creative mayors of the city of Bogota, Colombia. And you can read about him if you Google Bogota, Mayor of Bogota. You'll get a wonderful article from the Harvard Review featuring this guy. He was a 52-year-old mathematics professor who said to himself, there has to be something more important to do with my life than teach university mathematics, even though he was a much beloved professor. So he decided to run for mayor. He was elected. Now, Bogota at that time was one of the most violent cities on the planet. A horrendous murder rate. Women couldn't go downtown because they would be mugged by little children who would beat them up and steal their purses. The people hated their city. It was terrible gridlock in the traffic all the time, and there was a huge gap between rich and poor. So the first thing he did was he fired all of the traffic, the corrupt traffic police who were on the public transportation and on the street corners, and he replaced them all with pantomime artists. So this guy is carrying a sign and it says incorrecto. And what he's doing is he's pointing out that this man is jaywalking, and everybody around is laughing. And pretty soon this man will turn around and be embarrassed, and he won't jaywalk again, and everybody will laugh. Well, they put up these traffic policemen at all of the intersections. So instead of coming up and having the policemen like this, they have a pantomime artist directing the traffic, and everyone slowed down to watch and see what was happening. Everyone was laughing. All of a sudden, they were enjoying themselves. They replaced a lot of the roads. They stopped repairing roads and making the city a city for cars, and began pouring money into public transportation and making it so that it was comfortable, fast, convenient, and efficient, as Curitiba had done. The mayor was very concerned that the women couldn't go downtown because it was so dangerous, so he declared 3 nights that would be women's nights in downtown Bogota. And he said, on these nights, there will be cafes and bars and jazz bands playing, and we invite all the women to come downtown, and the men to stay home and look after the children. And the men said, no way, we're staying home and looking after the children. We have to be downtown. And he said, I didn't mean that you couldn't go downtown, and it would be so wonderful if you stayed at home instead. But if you have to be downtown, write yourself a note of safe passage, a certificate, and you have to come downtown. So 700,000 women went downtown each night for 3 nights and transformed the city. Suddenly they owned their city again. Oops, one more thing he did. Whoop, back to this one. The first action that he actually took was that there was a drought and they desperately needed water conservation. So he went on television and took a shower. He turned on the water, got himself wet, turned off the water, soaped himself down, turned on the water. And water consumption dropped 40%. So my point here, I guess, is about how do we change the way people think? Well, boy, it's not by putting more police on the streets. It's so interesting. Project Alcatraz. This is one I just heard about 2 weeks ago on the BBC. And again, if you Google this now and do BBC and Project Alcatraz, you can read this whole story. Excuse me, this is a very, very wealthy landowner. This is him being interviewed by the BBC. The guy in the middle is this wealthy landowner. And his name is Alberto Balmer. His hacienda is something like 18,000 acres, can't remember, huge. And what they grow is sugar cane, and they have a rum distillery that's been in the family for more than 100 years. So a very, very wealthy man who had already demonstrated a sort of different response to the actions of the local peasants, who 500 of them occupied his hacienda, his fields, because they were starving, because they were so poor. And instead of kicking them off, he welcomed them and he built houses for them and then asked that the Venezuelan government build housing for the remaining ones that he couldn't do. So he had all of these villagers, built them houses, trained them, and then put them to work in his sugarcane fields and in the distillery. Then one evening, 3 members of a local gang came and held up, mugged the security guard and had a gun. And he was shocked, but the security guards managed to overwhelm these fellows and brought them in handcuffs into Vollmer's office. And he looked at them and he said, take off their handcuffs, we need to talk. So he said to these men, okay, here's the deal. You can either go to the police, you'll be turned over to the police right now, or you can stay here for 3 months. You don't go home, you don't call, you don't phone, you don't get in touch with your wives, there'll be no drugs and alcohol. You go way up into the mountains here and you work, and you get up at dawn with the rest of the workers and you train and you get education, you have to study, you have to play football. And there's no drinking and no drugs. And they said, yeah, we'll take that, sure, we'll go out into the mountains, okay. So on they went up into the mountains, but, you know, the word got out to the outside, and pretty soon, the rest of the gang appeared at the, oh no, he first of all said, let's send the word out to other gang members who might want to do this. Let's diminish the size of this gang. Well, all 22 members of the gang arrived at the gate and said, we want the same deal. Well, he was a bit taken aback, but he said, okay, and sent them up into the hills. And then a week later, the rival gang that had been murdering these guys, and they had been murdered, they all arrived, and they said, we want the same deal too. And he said, but you're killing each other all the time. Oh, we won't kill each other if we're working together. So off they went. And soon he had over 100 men up there working, and they would do the 3 months, and then they were allowed to have their wives and families with them, but they continued with education. Many of them have gone on to university. About 20 of them have failed and gone back onto the streets, but more than 75 of them are now working. So he's been recognized by Chavez for this amazing project. These are some of the criminals. And that doesn't show up very well, but that's their hacienda, Santa Teresa. Medellin is another city in Colombia. It had this murder rate of 184 per 100,000, which was one of the highest in the world. And they decided that they were going to do everything possible to change the kind of social contract between the state and the people. And the thing that they found most effective was setting up libraries in beautiful parks. And as soon as they started doing that, they found people assembled in these libraries, that children read out loud to children who were younger than they were, and children, young students, read to older people who were illiterate. They put in free internet access, and these places have become hubs of community. And Medellin, I think it's pronounced Medellin, is it? I'm not a Spanish scholar, I'm sorry, but I heard it on the BBC as Medellin, so that's what I'll say. Is that right? That's right, thank you. Anyway, they proceeded to put in more and more projects that brought people together instead of increasing the police force. So changing the world. I guess we bring about change at 3 different levels. At the level of our personal lives and our own commitment to whatever you want to call your personal journey. We do it at the level of our neighborhood, our local community, the places where we're well known. And we do it by participating in global change and being sure that the values that we have in our own local communities are being carried forward at the international level. This is my editorial comment. We must regain our spiritual connections with the earth and with each other. And I love this quotation from Morris Sendak. Remember him from Where the Wild Things Are, which you read when you were a little kid? There must be more life than having everything. Just love that. When I was in the Soviet Union in 1986, I was given this absolutely amazing interpreter named Sasha Agapiev. He was a huge fat man. He was about 300 pounds and about 5 feet tall, and chain smoker, traveling with 10 doctors. You can imagine how that worked. Anyway, Sasha was terribly, terribly funny. And when we arrived in Moscow and we just finally got settled in our hotel rooms, he wrote his telephone number down for me and he handed it to me and he said, "Mary, if there is anything at all that you need, here is my telephone number. Just call me. I will tell you how to live with that." And I think we need a 1-800 number. I'll often say, I just have to have a convection of them. And they'll tell you, right? That's okay. I'm going to stop there so that we can take questions.
And he's one of our participating social justice studies professors, so take it away.
Well, thanks for that generous introduction. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks, Mary, for the talk. I was thinking, I had a kind of advanced look at the PowerPoint slides, and I was kind of thinking about reactions to them on the way over here. And I was saying this to Laura Parisi as we were chatting in the hall out there, but we've now all heard the talk. How subversive good news can be. We're so used to good news being, I think, kind of hegemonized or occupied, colonized by the corporate sphere. We're kind of sold happy advertisements and so on and so forth. And you, I think, can get into this habit of mind that to be progressive or oppositional or to be a fighter for social justice means being critical, and being critical means being critical and wearing black and smoking a lot, being extremely negative. And what that has done is created this, I think, kind of really large vacuum where optimism can be subversive if it's reclaimed. And I think that we've just been shown that in some extremely eloquent and quite moving ways. But I'm going to discuss it. And that means I can't just sit around and congratulate Mary on how wonderful her talk was and how optimism ought to be great. So I guess the theme of the short remarks I have here is just questions, criticism, a little bit of a pushback. Are things really all that good? And so on and so forth. But I did want to preface these remarks by saying how refreshingly subversive I did find the good news and the optimism. So basically, 3 things along these lines. one has to do with the obviously diminished severity and diminished frequency of wars. And obviously, one can't quarrel with the statistics. The information is there. But it leaves me with kind of a disturbing question, because the phrase that I was always brought up with was that if you want peace, you work for justice. And the idea, I think, behind that slogan is that it's just social relations. It's human equality and fairness that is ultimately going to bring about the end of war. And so the thought that I'm left with is, I really don't have a feeling that since the end of the Cold War, we've seen gigantic leaps forward in terms of just social relations and just social relationships. And so it leaves me with this kind of disturbing question of, have we learned a lesson that peace actually doesn't require social justice? What's behind those statistics? What does that mean? And I guess it makes me worried that anti-war campaigners who've learned so successfully to wield instruments like international public opinion, like international law, might also be forgetting the if you want peace, work for justice lesson. So that's one thought there. The second thought that I had, kind of continuing with my cranky professor mode here, has to do with the forums of social change, namely international law and the United Nations, and I guess also more diffusely the idea of global civil society, is that the forums are all, I think, elitist, and I don't mean elitist in a pejorative way in the sense that they're designed necessarily to be elitist. They're elitist simply in the sense that it tends to require the ability to travel. It tends to require, I think, a certain comfort level in a different array of cultural, linguistic contexts, and these are things, obviously, that much more easily accrue to people who tend to be advantaged. So the second kind of concern is that do the new instruments of social justice fighting privilege elites of a certain sort and in a certain way, and then so there's a danger that there's the participatory base might be lost or forgotten here. And then I guess finally a question about the candle metaphor. And the metaphor is that it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. I think that's right. I guess I also think, though, that how do you know that you've lit the right candle? And how can you tell whether or not the candle's going to burn brightly long enough and shed enough light? And it's certainly the case, I think, politicians, corporate politicians, I think might like that metaphor, because that's kind of the way in which they sell their governance to the public with boutique programs. Oh, you're concerned about unemployment? Well, we've got 3 new programs. We've got this, have you seen our website? We've got this, we've got that. And what gets lost then is how much good really is being done. The point simply being, I guess, to bring these remarks to a close, is that there's a difference between pointing to particular success stories and having a really convincing overall view that things really are getting better. And so what's the difference between lighting candles on the one hand or a kind of politics of distraction that just sells good news that might not, at the end of the day, add up to much? Those are my thoughts, framed a little bit bluntly for the purpose of clarity, but I really did appreciate it.
First of all, I want to say, give my acknowledgments to the Coast Salish peoples on whose land we are on, and thank them for welcoming us to the territory. And next I'd like to say, oh wow, this is so fantastic. I can't believe I'm actually here at the inaugural lecture of the Social Justice Minor Program. Oh my God! I think we should all stand up and shout hooray! because, well, I don't know if you're going to do the selling thing about the social justice program, but it's not funded under core funding, and the university will only give money to support it under core funding if we can demonstrate enrollment. So, we launched the first course, Social Justice 100. It was fully enrolled in 2 days. Yay! And so we really wanted to get the word out and let people know that this is a fantastic opportunity. And Bill and the rest of us on the planning committee would be more than happy to sit down with anybody to talk to you about how you can work it into your existing program. So you can pay me for this, but that was a commercial break. So Mary, thank you so much for that wonderfully inspiring talk. It's so energizing to hear good news, and I have to reiterate what Matt said. Really it is. I've been doing this kind of social justice work at the local community for I can't say how long, and what keeps me going in doing all of this is the people that I meet and the relationships that I build, and really the small victories of everyday life that keep me going. So it was just wonderful to hear you and to meet you and to know that there's somebody like you working on these big global issues at that level and making a go of it. It's really inspirational. So thank you very much. Just a couple of things that I would like us to think about in relation to your talk. You talked about kind of 4 levels or 4 sites for forces of change. There's the international level and the UN, civil society, media, and communication networks, and women. And then there are the others, you said. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how these forces interconnect and how they support each other. Because it's not as though women are outside of the international level, because they're also there. And it's not as though civil society is disengaged from the state of the economy. They're absolutely interlinked. And the media is also linking all of this. And one of the things that we need to understand about how this works, and this speaks to what Matt was commenting about in terms of his concern over kind of stratification of power, and where at the international level seems to be a place for kind of elite participation. And I think in a certain respect that's true, but in other respects it's not true. And so in thinking about this, we have to figure out ways in which we can make that link from the very local community to the global. And those links are being made, in particular, by NGO groups in civil society. But those NGO groups in civil society are also hierarchically organized, even at the global level. So for example, we can make the distinction between southern NGOs and northern NGOs, and the same power imbalances that we observe in our own organizations and institutions and interpersonal relationships are also fractally reflected in those kinds of relationships, so that southern NGOs do have a mediating role in the kinds of issues and resources that are available to southern NGOs. So we know that. We know that. So the Canadian International Development Agency, the Swedish International Development Agencies actually provide the funding resource to support many of those NGOs. So I think that kind of intermediation is really important to bear in mind. Even in our own local NGOs, we know that the state is critical in funding those very same food banks that are held up as NGOs, as kind of as examples of community-based initiatives. The state has intermediated and actually set the agenda for many of the organizations. And which brings me to Sarah Palin. That percent. When Sarah Palin says to, stands up and claims herself to be a soccer mom, what's she doing? What is Sarah Palin doing when she says, I'm a soccer mom? Well, she's talking to her constituency in civil society. And so it reminds us that civil society is not a monolithic entity that's always working towards social justice. It's as diverse and it's as complicated as any other entity. So strategically, what does that mean in terms of the role of civil society in making change? It does mean that we have to communicate better among ourselves and to seek out those like-minded organizations and individuals and support each other, and to resist that tendency to fight among each other for scarce resources. And this is what I see happening time and time and time again in so many organizations, women's groups, where divisions occur and then there's a struggle and they implode, and then that possibility for moving the agenda forward gets stalled. And so, there's, as you say, Matt, there's a lot of complications in the good news stories. But I'm so happy to hear the good news stories. I do also want to talk about Amnesty International. And as an international organization, how crucial Amnesty International was to bringing attention to the Stolen Sisters campaign, and that Amnesty International has now released a second report and shaming Canada into its neglect of over 500 women who have been murdered or disappeared with impunity, it seems. And so by going up to the international arena, local women's groups have been able to draw attention to issues that the Canadian government refuses to attend to. So that kind of interconnection occurs as well. Is there something else, or should I finish? Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was you spoke a lot about human security, and I think it's really, really important to use the language of human security as a counterbalance to the state discourse of national security. Because national security has been very dangerous for those of us who are not seen to be legitimate members of the nation. And so the rise of new racisms against so-called Arab terrorists, it has been justified under the security of the nation at the expense of really peace and human security. So I think it's really important for me to continue to talk about human security and not get sucked into the language of national security. I think I'd like to stop there, and thank you again very, very much.
I guess I want to start by telling a little story about myself, because I think it tells something about the perspective I'll bring to this conversation tonight. And that's my history, first as an educator, and so not so surprising in the Faculty of Education, someone who's been an educator most of her life, but someone who also took on a very political role in the political systems. I was an elected MLA for 5 years for Kamloops, a cabinet minister, and worked in the NDP government from 96 to 2001. And why do I tell you that story? Well, because I think what I'm trying to talk about is the complexity of systemic change and individual action. Because in both of those situations, there was the opportunity as a teacher activist in my own community, working at an individual level, to be able to bring about change, to enact, to have a passion for issues of justice and equity and equality. And I'm here to tell you that educators, both as adult educators and K-12 educators, many of them take up that cause. In fact, some people would call them bridge people, in the sense that they bridge these notions of equity and justice, and they bring those understandings through educative means into communities, into their own practice, into the lives of the children, the adults, the adolescents they work with. So what I want to talk about is what I saw implicit in your conversation was the power of education. And I wanted to bring attention to the ways in which education can be a catalyst for thinking about how social justice is activated locally and systemically. So as a politician, I saw evidence of the kind of forces that Mary-Wynne was describing in terms of the civil society, in terms of government and systemic change. But I also saw the ways in which politicians could take up the individuality, the individual causes that local and personal actions for change were acts that people took up and tried to influence outcomes. So it seems to me that instead of creating these dualities, which we often do about systemic versus individual change, or whether we can work locally or globally, rather it's much more complex and interrelated, and that our work has to be to find the tools through which to make that happen. And I believe education is a key piece of how we do that. You also talked a bit about women, and I did want to talk about women as a force for change, because as educators, adult educators, K-12 educators, women are a driving force in the profession, and the profession is becoming more and more dominated by the work of women. But frankly, I think that is the catalyst that is causing some change in the education system itself. And I'm only going to draw on one example to talk briefly about this, but this is the advocacy that organizations like the British Columbia Teachers Federation and individual teachers are taking around issues related to queer and questioning youth, make systemic as well as local change. And they do those kind of creative, courageous acts that you described in taking up the kinds of practices that have been systemically a part of the Indian culture. Now, some of that's not pretty, and some of it is quite ugly, but as a result of that individual action as well as the systemic change, what's happening is now some state governments have increased the quota to 50%. And not only that, women are now standing in positions outside of the quota system. So even at the local level, they've moved from 33% to close to 45% in a course of 10 years. So this is the power of education to bridge between the policy initiatives, between those national, international, and civil society organizations, systemic kind of work. And it speaks, I think, to the ways in which education is a core foundation of how we move forward and create a just and inclusive society. Thank you.
I'm going to start at the tail end here, responding to what Catherine said about the new policies in India, and those are actually in many, many different countries now. I didn't realize it had gone to 50%. I write about this in the book because it was so new to me that it's Bangladesh and Pakistan and Rwanda and a whole series of countries where the women at the local level are empowered to serve on their local councils. And I remember Mary-Wynne Ashford, who's a lawyer, was taking part in going around and encouraging the NGO participation to train these women, because many of them were illiterate. So they first had to learn to read and write and learn numeracy and then take up their jobs. And the men were trying to prevent that from happening. So they would divide the little council chamber with a curtain and say, well, the tradition is that the men sit on this side and make the decisions and the women sit on the other side. And these NGOs were able to say, no, that's not how democracy works. Here's how it works. And teaching the women what were their rights and their responsibilities. And one example that she gave was of a little village where they had, for some reason, a grant of money, and the council was trying to decide what to use it on. And the man said, well, we should pave the road to our mayor, the head man's house. And the women said, no, that is a ridiculous waste of money. Everyone is walking barefoot, and why on earth do we need a paved road when there's only one car? And they said, instead of that, we need to build an elementary school, and it needs to go up beyond grade 6. It needs to be probably up to about grade 8. And it has to have bathrooms with doors so that the girls can stay in school after they reach puberty, because otherwise they couldn't continue in the schools. And the man, bless them, said, that's a good idea. Now, it's not that there was a huge friction so much as that it hadn't crossed their minds that building a co-educational school would be an awfully good idea for the whole village. So in a way, it advanced the whole social cooperation in that community, and it seems to be a really, really important thing. The other thing that I meant to talk about, and I didn't have enough time, I cut it out of my talk, is the movement in Africa started by the illiterate peasant women working in an NGO in Kenya and a few of the other African countries to end the practice of female genital mutilation. And if you are working on how social change happens and are interested in the anthropology of that, look up the work that's reported by UNIFEM about how those women set about to bring about a social change to end a practice that's probably 5,000 years old, that is so important in the lives of the women there, that really that procedure, which was carried out on more than 9% of little girls, defined what was desirable in women, what was marriageable. And to stop doing that practice meant that they had to face the possibility that they would never marry, or their daughters would never marry. And yet they set up this huge system to change the whole culture around it. And it's just breathtaking to read about that. The other thing I wanted to point out, I'm so glad you mentioned that you were an MLA, is that having spent so many years in resisting the government and opposing everything the government was doing, that gradually I got to meet more and more people who served in government. And I've eaten a lot of crow, I can tell you, because these people are working so hard and just have so many things that make their work really, really difficult or impossible. And I always want you to know about our mission at the United Nations and how those bureaucrats do the most amazing things behind the scenes that we never hear about, like staying up all night, the night at the end of the discussions on the Non-Proliferation Treaty in the year 2000, when it was clear that the whole thing was just going to be flushed down the toilet. And instead, Chris Westall rewrote the language so that it was acceptable, and they ended up with an agreement the next morning. Now, George Bush negated it 3 weeks later, but never mind. They did that, and it was our guys in New York. So you get people everywhere. You've got to seek them out and work with them and not just think, oh, that's just another politician. So, a little bit of that. The candle metaphor, you know, you raise a really interesting question. And this is a question that I faced in writing the book. Am I just one of those Pollyanna people who seeks out the good stories and, you know, meanwhile the rest of the world is going straight to hell and I'm just noticing these little tiny candles that are lit here and there? And my conclusion by the end of it, because I actually signed the contract that there would be 101 solutions, and then I thought, no, 50. What there are? 101. But as I started writing to people about their projects and saying, this is what I've written about your project, please check it for accuracy and send me back any others that you know of, I got many more than 1,000 of these examples. And that was when I started getting the hair standing up on the back of my neck. And I'm thinking, I think we are in the process of a global social revolution. I think that's what's happening. It's nothing short of that. And that I am seeing it. I'm seeing it when I go to the Philippines and I meet with the women in the Philippines or the women in Kenya. And I'm hearing what they're saying. And these women are at the microphone, and I know that they are not educated women, but they are saying social theory that you learn at university in economics or in political science. And I'm thinking, this is really amazing what is happening. And so it's possible that this is just a blip. And I guess my answer to that is to say, then get up and make sure it's not a blip. Don't leave it to anybody else to do. The job is not over till Fat Lady sings, and we're not there yet. We've got to keep plodding on with this in every direction. I think that the trend away from war is a trend that's based in social justice. I think that's how we got there. I don't think it's being forgotten. I think it's at the root of the whole thing. That now, even in places like the Congo, there is shame brought to bear on the atrocities that are happening. And that is something new in the case of war. We're talking about rape as a tool of war, and we're talking about these people being found guilty of criminal offenses under this as crimes against humanity and war crimes. These are all changes that are, because they're being embedded in international law, they're permanent changes. And so I see this as really, really progressive. One more thing about women, and then I'll stop. There's a woman I quote in the book, Caprioli, is that it? Who's in women's studies? Do you know Mary Caprioli's work? I think that's what her last name is. Anyway, she has written about comparing societies in the 1960s with societies in the 1990s and looking at measures of independence and strength of women. So women were in the economic area, had jobs, in other words, whether women had the vote, whether women could run for office, and how many children they had. Because usually the bigger the families, the less power a woman has. And then comparing that with how many wars there were in the world at that time, how much internal conflict and so on. And the correlations are just absolutely staggering, because it appears that the more engaged women are in leadership, the less likely the country is to engage in war. So it's big, important shifts that I'm hoping are not reversible.